Hello and welcome back to the Talking Leadership TV podcast series. Thanks for joining me again. Has been some time between podcasts and I'm looking forward to sharing today's discussion. My guest today is Dr. Oliver Greeves. He's an experienced executive with extensive exposure to the major business segments and geographies served by a global insurer and global bank. During Oliver's career, he served in New York, Hong Kong, South Korea, Malaysia, Australia and the United Kingdom. He had a 13-year assignment in New York reshaping the development strategy of MetLife globally, as well as serving as the Chief Investment Officer and President of MetLife Asia Pacific Division. Oliver has extensive management experience in directing marketing and sales teams as well as project teams and retail operations. Human capital and organisation development have been the key ingredients in the business growth for which he's been responsible. The development of teams and individuals who excel are at the forefront of Oliver's methodology and as such are the foundation of a successful coaching practice that has added the principles of psychology to his extensive knowledge of business practice and procedure as well as mentoring of talented managers. I really enjoyed this discussion with Oliver, which focused on strategy and leadership. But as always, enough from me. I'll hand over to today's guest, Dr. Oliver Greeves. Oliver, thank you for joining us here on the Talking Leadership TV podcast. Thank you very much for your time, mate.
Well, it's very nice to be here and nice to be with you, Eric. Looking forward to your questions.
Yeah, look, I'm very much been looking forward to having the conversation. So a mutual friend of ours, Dr. Wade, as me suggested, I reach out and we've had some conversations in the lead up to having this particular chat. So I'd like to start with, if we can, for you to share your definition of leadership, please.
Well, leadership is one of those sort of terms that's got 1,000 different definitions. You can sort of think of it in terms of command and control leadership, a general in an army, through to someone exercising, say, servant leadership, which is really thinking of the other person and what they need. So in between there's a whole scatteration of different definitions, but I kind of like Drucker's idea of leadership as a means to an end. I think that's a really good term. And what he means by that is really that the leader is trying to achieve something through an organization and delegation. And the leader's job, his work, is to think through the organization's missions, defining those missions, and then based on those missions or mission, setting goals, priorities, and standards. That's sort of Drucker's view of leadership. And I use that definition liberally in my coaching practice.
You mentioned the word servant leadership. That has come up a lot in my discussions around, is the leader's role to be upfront, or is he or she a maybe servant is the best word, of the people and the teams that they're leading, and everything sort of in between. And the definition that is least brought up, and I can understand why, is that command and control. Is that I don't think success comes from that approach to leadership. However, we've all experienced those that use that style of leadership, much to our chagrin and upset at times. But you get to learn from poor application of command and control. And I would put it to you that perhaps those that go down that pathway potentially don't trust their people. I'm sure you've encountered the individuals that like command and control because that's the path of least resistance to get things done. That doesn't necessarily do anything for your team. So as a segue into the next theme or question that I'd like to put to you, Oliver, do you believe your view of leadership and how it's defined from your perspective has changed over time for you, or at least through your career, as an example?
Well, yes, I think it has. There are, of course, several other elements in leadership other than thinking through the mission, setting goals, priorities, and standards. And so perhaps that's where I started as a young leader. I started thinking that that's what leadership was all about. But other things have made their way into my idea of leadership and how I can be a better leader. And some of these things, I think, have evolved as sort of time has gone by. So I'd like to mention some of them. So one of them that's perhaps understood in a theoretical way, but perhaps not so much in a practical way, is that a really good leader is someone who's able to balance priorities on their way to reaching the goals and hence the mission. So what do I mean by that? Well, they have to balance their attention to short-term exigencies or demands that are made on their leadership with an equal focus, though perhaps not at the same time, on the longer-term strategy. So if you have a leader, we could perhaps use Scott Morrison as an example. I think Scott Morrison was someone who had a laser focus. He was very task-focused, and that made him very successful on certain specific issues that confronted his government. But somehow he lacked long-term political strategy, and perhaps that's why he didn't make it through to the next term. So a good leader is someone who balances this short-term attention to detail and the necessities of the day-to-day, at the same time holding in their mind thoughts about the future and sequencing actions which are going to secure the long-term future along with the short-term. I hope that's not too complicated, but what people usually call those who are successful leaders in being able to do this balancing act is they are critical thinkers. And I think that as time has gone by, I've valued critical thinking more and more. So another thing which I think goes into Drucker's idea of leadership, but which I think I gradually took on board, was this issue of selecting the leaders who work for you. So, very often a young leader will be quite limited in how they judge people who come to them. What walks through the door gives you a 10-minute presentation and a flick through their resume. Hey, this looks like a good person. Give them a job, put them in a position. They've already done this and that. I'm very impressed with their experience. I think I can use them to accomplish this, that, and the other. No. If you do that, you will find fairly quickly there's a reason why they left the place they were at before. And it'll all become very apparent that perhaps they don't present quite the way they set themselves up. So I think that ability to select leaders and to understand them before you appoint them is really super important. And I always think of my daughter. She was when she left college, she'd done quite well at college, and we were living in America, and she was selected by Goldman Sachs to work as an associate over there. Now, as part of the selection process to go and work for Goldman Sachs, this is a 3-year job, by the way. This is not a full-time employment. This is 3 years in which you will work night and day as a slave, and you'll be paid quite well. But at the end of the 3 years, they'll throw you off the bus. Most of them. My daughter was actually asked to stay. But I'm giving you this as a sort of a setting. When Goldman she got past the first stage of her interview, she was interviewed 20 times, 20 separate occasions. I recognize that she's only about 22 years old, 23 years old at the time. She goes through 20 interviews, including, even though she's the most junior person in the department, the managing director of that particular function. So that gives you an idea how a firm like Goldman, which is really values leadership very highly, selects people extremely carefully. And so that's another thing which I think is very important that I've learned within leadership, is that how do people get selected, and making sure everybody's in agreement before this person comes on board, and particularly they can fit in with other people, whether they are able to operate within a team environment. So then another element which I've learned as time has gone by is this issue of how do you empower people once you've taken them on board. it's one thing to say, well, I've got this department over there. You're in charge of that department. Nice to know you. Get on with it, and we'll talk as you go. Or do you sort of watch them a little bit to begin with and see how much they really know and how they're fitting in, and then gradually release power to them? So you empower them steadily based upon what you're observing. So you don't put them in a position where they've got all the responsibility and all the power and they're set up to fail. So that process of observing the capability of your leaders and then gradually delegating power and authority to them until they've got as much or more than they can, a little bit more than they can handle. That I think is very important. And then the last one, which is that you as a leader, very often when you take over a job, people don't know who the heck you are. You've just been recruited or you've been summoned in from some other part of the organization, and they're giving you this responsibility, and you've thought about your mission and your vision and so on and so forth, and you expect immediate loyalty, trust, and obedience, etc., and it doesn't seem to work out. Well, I think the reason for that is that leaders have to earn trust. So you've got a certain amount of time during which you as the leader should recognize that you're earning the trust of the people who are working for you. And the best way to earn that trust is by being honest and showing that you're consistent. You're not doing this with this person and something different with that person. You're not managing politics in the office by favoring this group over that group. You are showing all the signs of someone who's got a high standard of integrity, and then people gradually will buy into what you're doing, and then you'll have the authority, the moral authority, to be a good leader. So those are some of the things that I've learned over time.
Yeah, interesting list, Oliver. There's so many rabbit holes we could go down with that
Yeah.
response, but I'll go with the one that resonates. The one that resonated with me quite strongly is this idea of having a system or a process to find the leaders that are most prepared to fit into the culture that you've created. Because a lot of times people are coming into leadership roles in organizations of various kinds and various sizes where there is already a culture there. And as much as the teams over time adapt to the leader needs to adapt to the culture that they find. Now, the other side to that coin, and this is one that I'm constantly fascinated by what leaders' opinions are on this, is when you're in the position to create a culture, what is for you going to be the most dynamic culture to get the best out of your people and hopefully yourself? And I think there's a massive time element there. People need to see you succeeding. I think your teams want to see you fail occasionally, or at least pick
Mm,
yourself up and look and appear and act like you're a human being and that you're not
mm,
flawless and that there are some things that you need to do better. And I think that
mm,
the humanization of the leader is, I think, what you're referring to before, but because before you get to any point of authentic leadership or moral authority in the space that you're working in, you've got to demonstrate your chops, so to speak. And it's not just
mm.
barking orders, it's working with the team. I think that's a crass but overview summary of what you've just said.
I think that's a very good point, actually, that the leader has to show some runs on the board other than just where they've come from, what they've done before. And I can remember on one occasion taking over this new job, and I really didn't understand the job very well. It was in an area adjacent to that where I'd been before, and it took me some time to figure it out. And while I was figuring it out, I was back in the office, and other people were out doing deals and doing business and so on and so forth. And I was busily studying what I was going to do and how I was going to do it. Some of these things that we've already talked about, and somebody came to me at some point and sort of said, "You know what, Oliver, forgive me for saying this, but you're spending a powerful amount of time in the office. Um, we're all out there reaching for the stars. We'd like to see you hit a couple of home runs." Okay. Well, there was a deal that was, being considered at that time, which was to do with raising about $2 billion for a big electrification project in China. And I decided, okay, I'll lead this team. And so I did. And I was out of the office for the next 6 months, a lot of the time, a lot of the time. And finally, we did this deal, and it was all very successful. We got a lot of publicity, and there was a big signing, and the great hall of the people, and everybody else, all the non-participants got all the glory, etc., as usually happens. But I could sense when I got back, there was a certain sort of pride that people had that I was able to get this done. And after that, I noticed that it was much easier to get people to do what I wanted them to do, or to follow what I was leading, where I was leading. So yeah, agree with that.
When people learn through a career that example came to you very quickly in your mind, because obviously it was one of those seminal points in how you did what you did as a leader to go, yeah, this is when I opted to get out of my comfort zone and do what I needed to do to
Right.
make something succeed. I love listening to that kind of conversation, and so that segues, I think, quite nicely into my question around the next theme, and this one is around strategy. So, in its broadest terms, leaders are in roles to do a lot of things, but primarily lead and help develop strategy, and hopefully strategy that is not just surface level, but does something to progress the vision and mission of the place that you're working in. So
Mm.
I'll draw on your experiences again, if you'll indulge me. What in your mind constitutes good strategy? If you had to sell this to someone and the Oliver Greeves 3 points or 4 points of great strategy, what does that look like for you?
Well, obviously, in a fairly long business career, I've been involved in a lot of strategy, and I've sat through endless strategic meetings and met all the strategic consultants and heard other people's strategy and so on. This is You can't go very very long in business without getting into this area. And I think um, in my dealings with strategy, um, I tended to think of it because I had an economics background, a conceptual background. I tended to see a strategy within the development of a marketplace and an organization in the marketplace, and where it stood in the marketplace, and where it come from, where it was trying to go to. So, um, in other words, I tended to view strategy as having a large component of history in it, understanding the history of the organization, understanding the history of the marketplace, and looking for trends that were recognizable. You know, so I think that's true. But over time, and especially since I've been in the coaching business with Wade Asme, I've moved more towards the question of how can you envisage what the future is. And Wade has done a lot of research, um, and what he's done, which I think is really good, is to consider the three elements that go into a good strategy. One is the past. Where have we come from? Where are we going to? What are the trends in the industry? What are the secular trends in the economy, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? And then the second one, which again is not unsurprising, where are we in the present? Can I have an honest assessment of what we're doing and how we're performing today relative to our competitors, and so on and so forth? So you've got the past, the present, and then we get to the future, which is obviously where the strategy is meant to be, is meant to produce change, right? And when we look at the future, the problem is we can either get too stuck in the past and the present in reading the future, or we have to think and start to think very differently. And Wade Asme and some of his colleagues have developed a notion of foresight, right? And we like to think of foresight. We like to think of foresight as being something like intuition. It's innate. It's somebody who's somehow mysteriously is able to conjure up a picture of the future and act on it, right? But no, I mean, I think what Wade has been able to do is to show that foresight is based on certain organizational factors which can be changed, and the individual can learn foresight. It's a remarkable breakthrough, in my opinion, because so many people in industry and commerce today lack this quotient of foresight when they're developing strategy, right? So I think that's about all I'll say on that. I don't know whether you'd like to ask a follow-up question on it.
Yeah, sure. The need to look at a future's perspective in the development of strategy is, I think there's been mixed responses to what that necessarily needs to look at and what are the inputs into trying to develop what is possible futures versus realizable futures, and what can you actually achieve versus what is nice to maybe get to, but maybe we can't get there for one reason or another. And this conversation, what fascinates me about what we're talking about now is whether or not in the development of effective and strategy that can pivot when it needs to is where you get your information, where you get your data is going to necessarily impact where that strategy might go. So it's almost like and this is me remembering back to my uni days around using statistics packages, garbage in, garbage out. So if you're not
Right.
trying to tease out the best information that you can get, it's going to be difficult to do. Now, having said all that, I think it's also the ability to draw on not just the intuition, but the skills and the knowledge of the people around you to help realize strategy. Now, there are multiple different views on that, and ultimately someone has to make the decision on here is the go, no go actions that we need to do to either go forward or do something else. This area of futures is quite an interesting one, and I myself have looked at strategy and foresight, and there are many different areas there of interest to me. But why I'm talking to you, so the podcast is not about me, it's about your perspective on this, is in the strategy processes you've been involved with before, and I don't need you to necessarily pick out one particular event, but in the main, is there something that is typically missed when developing strategy that you've seen in your travels
Yeah.
that leaders still either don't
Mm.
account for properly or miss out completely?
Well, I think so. I think one has to have a real understanding of the drivers of change, especially in business development strategies. So, for example, I spent a lot of time working on Asia Pacific business development, and if you're, and for a number of years, I was in the insurance industry. Now, if your driver of change is, let's say, size and growth of market, right? You take a country like Indonesia, for example, it's got a very large population, approaching 200 million people, right? So you say, well, is it growing? Yeah, it's growing very nicely. Thank you very much. Well, perhaps we should go and invest in Indonesia. Well, maybe not. Why not? Well, because it is an established fact that insurance, life insurance in particular, is extremely sensitive to the per capita income of the people. And in Indonesia, there are people who are very wealthy, and will probably buy a certain amount of life insurance, but there's an awful lot of people who can't afford to meet their food budget. So that's not a particularly good country to go to. Whereas, if you apply that metric to the Korean market, at least a few years ago, there's a huge opportunity there, right? So there's an example of a driver of change that you've really got to understand in your business, that's driving your business, and also the broader environment you've got to understand too. I never forget a Chinese ship owner that I knew many, many years ago. He built an enormous fleet of ships. Actually, interestingly enough, although he was based in Asia, most of his ships up were transatlantic. bulk carriers. And I'd said to him, what makes you confident to make these massive capital investments in all this shipping? You see, and he said, well, obviously the shipping industry and where it's going and its ups and its downs are part of it, but that's not the main thing. And I said, what is the main thing? He said, well, the three things that I think are really important are politics, economics, and business practice. What? He said, in Asia, politics has always been a serious problem that you've got to be careful of. Obviously, particularly China. If China sneezes, the rest of Asia catches a cold. So the politics is really important. And he said, generally speaking, the politics, at least at that time, the politics had been very bad, but it was getting better. And then he said the second thing is economics. Is there a strong economic basis for your investment decisions? And of course, in Asia, you've got this incredible work ethic. So virtually anything that you try to put into practice, you've got a workforce that is going to make sure it happens. So the economics of Asia, business in Asia is phenomenal. But then there's a third thing that he mentioned, and he said this is business practice. Business practice in Asia is very, very difficult. You've got to have belt and braces. There's a tremendous amount of fraud going on. There's a terrific opportunity to pick your pockets if you're an innocent showing up in Asia with a lot of money. And so business practice was a very, very important part of his strategy, you see. So there you have a set of drivers, which is nothing to do particularly with the shipping industry, but which is fundamental to his confidence to make investment decisions. And it's that kind of understanding of what is making the world go round, I think, that must inform a good strategy.
Yeah, I can't disagree. In fact, looking and understanding what those signals are in that marketplace, and what I think I'm hearing you say is not just the uh, market environment, but it's the socio-political, geopolitical considerations that you take into account. You've mentioned all of those when you're talking to your friend in that shipping space, and yeah, it makes for, I think, a better longer term strategy if those things are accounted for. Now, one thing you can't account for is potential change in a market overnight, or the impact of, let's say, a pandemic that we've all just come
Yeah.
through. So some things are completely out of your control. So I get that. One thing I'd like to ask you is, again, based on your experiences, where do you see at least the future of strategy going? If you were to look at into our collective crystal ball and say, right, I think strategy is going this way, do you get a sense of what that might look like based on your experiences, Oliver?
Well, drawing on some of those things that I pointed out, I think, especially if you look at Australia and the drivers of change in Australia, this country has had an incredible run of things. So if you're trying to develop strategy around a business in Australia and you look at the past, let's say the past 20, 25, 30 years, you'd say we've had tremendous growth, profitability, we've never had a real recession. I think we can rule the economy out of this, maybe politics too. Well, if you did that, I think you'd be missing a very, very important fact, which is that the Australian economy has increasingly been tied to the apron strings of China. So to understand what's going to happen to the future of this country, whether it's in the minerals industry or any even consumable items, you've got to consider the income potential of the population of Australia is heavily dependent on what is happening in China. And we haven't been able to diversify away from it. So that is an incredibly important strategic pendulum that is hanging over our heads. And I think if you ignore that at your peril. At the same time, we're obviously in a time of tremendous technological change that's taking place. And although we've been in this sort of technological change space for 20 or 30 years, there are things happening now which are even more testing for strategies. Artificial learning is AI, is the artificial intelligence, is the most obvious one, but there are many others too which are taking place. And if the organization is dependent on those technologies and people in the organization are not really technologists themselves and the leaders are not, then I think you've got some possibilities of something bad happening to you down the road. I think we could go on a number of other ways. I mean, I think leadership is under the gun at the moment. There's a tremendous, seemingly a vacuum of leadership in many parts of Australia, and which is worrisome. It means that over the last 20 years, the premium has not been on leaders who can manage through crisis. It's been on leaders who can say the right words, in my humble opinion. So that too is something which I think has to be taken into account.
I love it. That I was hoping you'd throw a grenade in there somewhere, and that last statement is one well worth thinking about. Now, I'm not going to disagree because I'm not sure, and I wouldn't have an argument to put against what you've just said around potentially a lack of leadership in certain areas. I think for me, where that particular comment and this gets nuanced is we're only as good as the amount of time we want to invest in developing the leaders of the future. And in my previous studies, for what this is worth, Oliver, this idea or the idea around what does fit for future leadership look like, we need to be having some important conversations around what are the capabilities we want our leaders in the future to have. So, given that we deal with other human beings, this idea of being a good communicator, being empathetic, understanding the non-work lives of your team, I think all leaders need to have that to some degree. Otherwise, you're not going to succeed. But there are some other capabilities that, at least for me, so I'm only talking Eric Perez here, this idea of building leaders around what is strategic thinking, what does it mean, what is foresight, what is futures thinking. These to me are some of the driving leader capabilities that we need to be having more conversations around, not less. I'm not precluding other leadership capabilities. I've been asked this on occasion, and just because it's my list of top 3 or 4 doesn't mean that it's the correct list. I'm just going by what I'm seeing in the literature and some conversations that I'm having, and these help to feed my understanding of things. But yeah, I don't disagree that we need to do more in that space. But fundamentally, it's where do we train the leaders of the future, and are our captains of industry, for want of a better term, investing the money the other way to bring up the leaders that are coming behind them. So for those that are in the age group that are retiring from leadership roles, to what degree are we empowering them to go back and teach some of the lessons that they've learned so you don't make the same mistakes, and are drawing from our elder leadership cadre in every industry is, I think, something we don't do well. And I think there's a wealth of information and experiences there that leaders on the come up would do well to engage with. But you have to have a culture that promotes that sense of ongoing learning. And unfortunately, amongst those that ply the leadership art, as it were, necessarily learning from others or having a lifelong learning orientation is not, I think, in the DNA of some leaders, and that's to our on longer term detriment. I hope that's not too harsh a comment, but I think there's some truth to it.
Well, I think so. I think if you look at where leaders have been preoccupied in recent years and where they've sort of spent their energies and so on, it's been sort of managing growth issues and competition, et cetera, et cetera. But if you go back in economic history a little bit, there was a time in which, let's say, 60s, 70s, where organizations did actually spend a lot of money developing leaders. They had training schools, they had programs, courses, they sent people off to business schools to get extra tuition, etc., etc. And some of that still goes on. But then we ran into the era of chainsaw Dunlap, where it was cost cutting. And I suppose that was an era ago, but nevertheless, it was an era in which huge amounts of money was taken out of developing people. And so if I look at the way people are developed today, it's very much on the job. It's like my youngest daughter has just got herself a job. Is she getting any special kind of, they're giving her some mentoring. They're taking her to meetings. They're telling her what to do. But is she getting anything extra? No. Is she likely to get anything extra? No. She's learning on the job, right? When I went into banking in London, I joined an elite program for the development of banking leaders. And it was a 3-year program. And it took us through effectively an MBA type program of understanding the nature of banking and risks that you take if you're a corporate banker. Plus, it took us into real life situations where we were given the opportunity to try to fly the beast, to fly the plane. No longer. That's all gone, And yet, in the case of my own experience, and in the case of many other people I knew, that training program was fundamental in shaping their thinking and how they looked at problems. So I think, this takes courage for leaders to go back and say, I'm going to put money into this.
Oliver, this has been great. Thank you for your time and your insights, mate.
It's been very enjoyable talking to you. Thank you.
Thank you. For those watching, this has been the Talking Leadership TV podcast series. Thank you for joining us. Have a great day, rest of your week, and we'll catch you on the next episode of the podcast.